We are in Chapter 2, Part 3 of The Rape of the Mind by Just A.M. Merleau, M.D. Pavlov also distinguished between the weaker type of involuntary learning, in which the learned response was lost as soon as some disturbance occurred, and the stronger type in which training was retained through all kinds of changed conditions. As a matter of fact, Pavlov described more types of learning than this, but for our purposes it is only important to know that there are some types of people who lose their conditioned learning easily, while others, the so-called stronger types, retain it. This, by the way, is another example of how our choice of words reflects our bias. The descriptions, strong and weak, depend completely on the aim of the experimenter. For the totalitarian, the weak POW is the man who stubbornly refuses to accept the new conditioning. His weakness may be in fact a resistance, the result of a previous strong conditioning to loyalty to anti-totalitarian principles. We never know how strongly conditioning and initial learning are impressed on the personality. Rigid dogmatic behavior has its roots in early conditioning, and so may submissiveness based on ignorance rather than knowledge. Pavlov showed too how internal and external factors interact in the conditioning process. If, for example, a new laboratory assistant was brought in to work with the animals, all of their newly acquired patterns could easily be inhibited because of the animals' emotional reactions to the newcomer. Pavlov explained this as a disruptive reaction caused by the animal's investigatory reflexes, which led them to sniff around the stranger. Current psychology tends to interpret it as the result of the changed emotional rapport between the animal and its trainers. We can easily expand the implications of this more modern view into the field of human relations. It points up to the fact that there are some persons who can create such immediate rapport with others that the latter will soon give up many old habits and ways of life to conform with new demands. There are inquisitors and investigators whose personalities so deeply affect their victims that the victims speedily yield their secrets and accept entirely new ways of thinking. We can see the same thing in psychotherapy, where the development of an emotional rapport between doctor and patient is the most important factor leading to cure. In some cases, rapport can be established immediately. In others, rapport cannot be built up at all. In most cases, it develops gradually during the course of the therapy. It is not difficult for a psychologist to test a man's softness and willingness to be conditioned, and as a matter of fact, the Pavlovians have developed simple questionnaires through which they can easily determine a given individual's instability and adaptability to suggestion and brainwashing. Pavlov found that all conditioning, no matter how strong it had been, became inhibited through boredom or through the repetition of too weak signals. The bell could no longer arouse salivation in the experimental dogs if it was repeated too often or its tone was too soft. A process of unlearning took place. The result of such internal inhibition of conditioning and the loss of conditioned reflex action is sleep. The inhibition spreads over the entire activity of the brain cortex. The organism falls into a hypnotic state. This explanation of the process of inhibition was one of the first acceptable theories of sleep. An interesting psychological question is whether too much official conditioning causes boredom and inhibition, and whether that is the reason why the Stakhanovite movement in Russia was necessary to counteract the loss of productivity of the people. We can make a comparison with what happened to our prisoners of war in Korea. Under the daily signal of dulling routine questions, for every word can act as a Pavlovian signal, their minds went into a state of inhibition and diminished alertness. This made it possible for them to give up temporarily their former democratic conditioning and training. When they had unlearned and suppressed the democratic way, their inquisitors could start teaching them the totalitarian philosophy. First, the old patterns have to be broken down in order to build up new conditioned reflexes. We can imagine that boredom and repetition arouse the need to give in and to yield to provoking words of the enemy. Later I shall come back to the system of negative stimuli used in conditioning for brainwashing. Mass conditioning through speech. According to official Pavlovian psychology, human speech is also a conditioned reflex activity. Pavlov distinguished between stimuli of the first order, which condition men and animals directly, and stimuli of the second order, with weaker and more complicated conditioning qualities. In this so-called second signal system, verbal cues replace the original physical sound stimuli. Pavlov himself did not give much attention to the second signal system. It was especially after Stalin's publication in 1950 on the significance of linguistics for mass indoctrination, as quoted by Dobrogev, that the Russian psychologists began to do work in this area. In his letter, Stalin followed Engels' theory that language is the characteristic human bit of adaptive equipment. That tone and sound and speech have a conditioning quality is something we can verify from our own experience in listening to or in giving commands, or in dealing with our pets. Even the symbolic and semantic meaning of words can acquire a conditioning quality. The word traitor, for example, provokes direct feelings and reactions in the minds of those who hear it spoken, even if this discriminatory label is being applied dishonestly. Through an elaborate study on speech reflexes written by one of the leading Russian psychologists, Dobrogev, we get a fairly good insight into the ways in which speech patterns and word signals are used in the service of mass conditioning by means of propaganda and indoctrination. The basic problems for the man-tamer are rather simple. Can man resist a government bent on conditioning him? What can the individual do to protect his mental integrity against the power of a forceful collectivity? Is it possible to do away with every vestige of inner resistance? Pavlov had already explained that man's relation to the external world and to his fellow men is dominated by secondary stimuli, the speech symbols. Man learns to think in words and in the speech figures given him, and these gradually condition his entire outlook on life and on the world. As Dobrogev says, language is the means of man's adaptation to his environment. We could rephrase that statement in this way. Man's need for communication with his fellow men interferes with his relation to the outside world because language and speech itself, the verbal tools we use, are variable and not objective. Dobrogev continues, speech manifestations represent conditioned reflex functions of the human brain. In a simpler way, we may say, he who dictates and formulates the words and phrases we use, he who is master of the press and radio, is master of the mind. In the Pavlovian strategy, terrorizing force can finally be replaced by a new organization of the means of communication. Ready-made opinions can be distributed day by day through press, radio, and so on, again and again, till they reach the nerve cell and implant a fixed pattern of thought in the brain. Consequently, guided public opinion is the result, according to Pavlovian theoreticians, of good propaganda technique, and the polls a verification of the temporary successful action of the Pavlovian machinations on the mind. Yet the polls may only count what people pretend to think and believe, because it is dangerous for them to do otherwise. Such is the Pavlovian device. Repeat mechanically your assumptions and suggestions, diminish the opportunity of communicating dissent and opposition. This is the simple formula for political conditioning of the masses. This is also the actual ideal of some of our public relation machines, who thus hope to manipulate the public into buying a special soap or voting for a special party. The Pavlovian strategy in public relations has people conditioned more and more to ask themselves, what do other people think? As a result, a common delusion is created. People are incited to think what other people think, and thus public opinion may mushroom out into a mass prejudice. And that ends this video, and we will pick up with chapter 2 in the next video. See you there. We're in the Rape of the Mind by Just Merleau, MD.